reminding myself daily to stop trying to figure things out.
Yeah.
Because there are things that we all face in life that we desperately would like to find answers for.
Yeah.
And when I have found myself literally battling those things and trying to find answers, I lose and lose and lose and lose over and over again.
Right.
But this experience of taking myself and placing myself at the altar and letting go of all of that, letting go of all my preconceived notions and the way I think things should work, the way I think things should work out.
Right.
You can begin to see the world in a different way. Welcome to The Sacred Life. I'm your host, Aaron Beachy, coming to you from Kokomo, Indiana. And today we are discussing a little bit about our experience with prayer or home altars, something along those lines a little bit. Today we have again with us John Baylor and David Baylor. And John is going to run this interrogation.
Yeah, I'll kind of act as the interviewer because this is a practice that both of you guys engage in ways that I don't, and so I'll just ask the questions, and then you guys can show us what it's all about.
Right.
And you mentioned experience, and a lot of our talks were kind of technical, theoretical, abstract, but in this one we'll try to be just very grounded in your personal experience of this. And then first of all would just be, I want to ask, what do you guys have that you might call a home altar or that I might call a personal shrine? I keep calling it a shrine, and David gets mad at me, but I'm not trying to be offensive.
We had a rather tense exchange.
Right. So just give a description so that the people listening can picture what is actually in your house.
Yeah. So I guess
You want me to start, or are you going to start?
go ahead, and then I'll follow.
All right, as you can see, we actually didn't plan this through very well. Yeah, so I guess my own experience with having a home altar is that I have one.
Yeah.
So just like having an actual physical space, something that is set aside and dedicated, I guess you would call it holy and sacred for the purpose of prayer. Like in my case, it's actually like I have a spare room in my house that I don't have any other need from, so it's like, okay, I'll just set this whole room up as my shrine. I guess in this case, shrine is appropriate.
Thank you.
The altar is within the shrine.
Yeah.
So like this is my prayer room. I don't know, like it gives me a place where I can just kind of get away from everything else. I don't know, step outside of the noise and the commotion.
Yeah. Well, for right now, let's just keep the visual description, because I will want to get into what's your practice and what's it mean to you and those questions as well. But right now we're just kind of setting the stage. So if you walk into this room, what are you going to see?
Okay, so you'll see up against one wall, the east wall. Maybe we can explain that later.
Okay.
There's a table that I made out of some scrap wood that I had in my barn, just like some old lumber that was in my, 100-year-old barn. And then but there's a tablecloth on it, and there's a cross on that table, and then there's some icons on the wall, like of Jesus and Mary and some saints,
Mm-hmm.
And things like that. And then I also, I use candles and incense as well, for the same reason of getting yourself into this mindset of prayer. I think for now that's a suitable explanation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The candles, incense. We'll talk soon about prostration or like bodily prayer practices.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this kind of language all the time in the Bible, and you can go without practicing that. You don't have to light a candle to pray, but the Bible does lay that out as a symbol of what prayer is, and it seems like you might as well live out that symbol rather than just read it as words on the page.
Yeah, right. And I would just attest that actually having a way in which your body and your senses participate in prayer like it's not just like an abstract theory, like, oh, this makes sense to me. The Bible says, offer incense to the Lord, and so I'm going to offer incense to the Lord. Or the Bible says, bow down and pray to the Lord. Or other people have a practice of crossing themselves in their prayers, and so here's the justification for that. Like what I would say is, a better argument is try it. Like, don't try to figure it out. Try it, engage in it, and you will learn there is something to it. Like your body is a part of you, and it's involved in the act of worship and prayer just as much as your mind or your spirit or your emotions, and those other parts of you are.
Right. I want to jump over to Aaron really soon, so I don't want to
All
develop
right.
this thought too much more. But I have this experience that when you prostrate in prayer, there's almost this sense of like, I thought I was bowing down in my heart in the past, but now that I do it with my body, I realize that what I was doing before wasn't this.
Right.
Okay, but I will jump over to you, Aaron, and then just the same question. When you walk in, where are we in your house, and what do we see there?
Yeah, so where my altar is it's in my bedroom these days. Previously, when I lived in my own home, I had a separate room set up, like David discussed. But because of circumstances with my family, and I live with my widowed mother for the time being, so it's just my bedroom for now. So it's more of a private situation. The rest of my family isn't as accustomed to this type of practice. So,
Yeah, right.
That's where it is. But if you face my altar, actually I have kind of a separate station that is used for confession. And then you have the altar, which is used for what I would call deeper prayer and things like that. The station of confession I use is a place to obviously, confess my sins, but also to get out of my system my own, I like to call them my own little selfish prayers and things like that, so that when I go to the altar, the prayer is not about me. It's beyond me. But my altar is similar to what David described. It's actually the table that I use. I had made the table to be used as like a coffee table in the middle of the living room. But when I got involved in the making of the table, it became a hobby. I made it very extravagant and finished it very nice, and was like, this is too nice, and I didn't know what to do with it. And then it came to me to use it as an altar.
Yeah.
So it's there with a red linen cloth across the top of it. There's candles there, obviously. On the wall behind the table, obviously in the center is an icon of Christ. To the left is an icon of Mary, and then to her left is an icon of the Apostle Peter. And then to the right of Christ is an icon of the St. John the Baptist, and then to his right is St. Paul. And then above Christ would be the seraphim. And then on the table itself would be the book of the Gospel, the book of the Apostles, and then in the middle the Psalter. And so that's kind of what it looks like.
Yeah.
If you would walk in and see it.
Okay, and I'll start this question with you, Aaron. Why is it that you decided to get involved in this process, or what process did you go through before you said, okay, I'm just going to do it?
Well, so one of the things that, I think at first when a person kind of starts that practice, especially coming from, being part of the Mennonite background and things, we're not, at least in modern times, we're not as ritualistic as maybe our Orthodox brethren are. And so for me, it was obviously a very unfamiliar thing. And I think in the beginning, I think you can kind of tend to fall into the trap of convincing yourself that the utility of what you're doing is somehow more righteous or something like that. But if one sticks with it, you will begin to develop a much more deeper, real relationship with God in prayer that really can't be explained, I guess. And so, say the original
Well,
question
just
again.
why, so you're trying to talk about some of the benefit that you get out of it, but you didn't experience those benefits before you tried.
Right.
So the question is, why did you try?
Oh, the reason why I tried is because I knew that I'm a sinful person, and I need more than what I needed, more than what I was experiencing when it comes to my walk with God.
Yeah.
And I will say that in my experience, one of the biggest things that a more ritualistic approach to prayer has done for me, or a deeper prayer approach, or a more disciplined prayer approach, has definitely brought into focus for me how sinful of a person I am and who I actually am as a person. It brings you to the reality of who you really are. And that's one of the things that I hear in reference to the walk of a Christian is be honest with yourself about who you are.
Well, like my observation, so like what's going through my mind when you're saying this is the question somebody might have of, like, I don't know, having an altar and having, these more physical things involved in your prayer. It's just often going to be like, why do I need that? And I guess I kind of have two seemingly contradictory answers to that, which is, the first one is, well, nobody says that you need it.
Right.
It's not a matter of you have to do it this way. It's a matter of it's better if you do. Like, that's just what I'm saying from my own personal experience. And I guess, like, can you trust somebody who's telling you from their experience that this has worked? That doesn't have to be me. There's plenty of others that are telling you that. And then the other seemingly contradictory answer is, are you sure that you don't need it? Like, you've never actually tried it, so you don't really know what you're missing out on. You're operating over here entirely in the realm of ideas. So like, you're trying to figure these things out strictly as like abstract concepts, or theorizing about what is and isn't necessary, or what is and isn't good, but you've never actually engaged in it. You've never actually dared to approach it. So you don't really know.
And I will add to that, like David just said, a person may have never actually engaged in it. I will say the process of me engaging in it has been a process that has gone on for probably about 4 years or more, maybe more than that. Like, the amount of my engagement, even when I set up my home altar for the first time, was much more limited than it is now. And it's one of those things where, like, coming from or being part of the modern Mennonite tradition, it's one of those things where you almost kind of have to wet your feet a little bit, and then you're not so sure if this is what you want or want to be part of, or if you want to go deeper. Because I will say this, like, and you'll probably get to this with one of your questions, but I will allude to this. Going to a deeper type of prayer like this does expose you to very direct spiritual attacks from demons. Like, it does. And you either have to choose to pull back in fear and apprehension, like
Jesus chose to approach that. I mean, like, it's very remarkable, the description in the Bible of Jesus going into the wilderness, that Jesus went into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil.
Well, so like the flip side of that is, I've run into this a lot personally. Like, even some people I know and respect will say, like, oh, you encounter these dark forces when you pray like this. That's proof that what you're doing is not Christian, because otherwise you wouldn't be encountering demons. And I guess my answer to that is, like, well, like what you said, Jesus stands against that.
Right.
The example of the prophets and the apostles stands against that. And then, like, I don't know if you value it at all, like, all of the teaching of the saints throughout the history of the church is basically, when you pray, you will be assaulted by demons. Like, this is going to happen because they hate prayer. The forces of the devil pray. The forces of the devil hate prayer. And like, this is why Paul says, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Like, it's in that context, I believe. Like, it's that you're engaging in an actual conflict with spiritual forces. It is too much for you, But since you're engaging in prayer, you're engaging in the thing that you need to stand, which is God himself.
Right.
Yeah, right.
And what I was going to say before you both so rudely interrupted me was that
Well, we didn't care what you were going to say.
you either have the choice of pulling back, and when I say pull back, remember when God asked the Israelites to draw close to the mountain, and they pulled back and said, "No, Moses, you go draw close for us."
Mm-hmm.
You can either do that and subsequently be less close to God, or you can go even further. You can go deeper, because and you have to go deeper if you want to find the power of Christ to overcome the demons. So that's been my experience with that.
Yeah.
I was thinking too, just like more along the lines of like actually physically engaging in prayer. You said we'd probably talk more about prostrating.
Oh, I don't know if that'd be in this video.
Yeah, but there's a little bit to say in this video
yeah.
about that. Like prostrating when you pray, like for one thing, usually the words translated, we've been over this before, the words translated in the New Testament as worship, both in Hebrew and Greek, literally mean prostrate. But like I just find for myself, like when I'm going through some difficulty, like the best thing for me to do oftentimes is just to go to my altar and just prostrate, and sometimes not even say anything, just like let it go, clear it out. And I don't know, like when you prostrate, you're putting yourself in a vulnerable position, and but also in a receptive position. So like when you're prostrating before God, it's like you're trusting God to, I don't know, not chop your head off. So it's like when you prostrate yourself, I don't know, like I just have this image in my mind when you're prostrating yourself before the king, like you're putting yourself in a position where your life is in the king's hands. And that's what you're doing with God. It's like you're recognizing my life is in your hands. I don't know, like you could say you have this prostration of the mind that goes on where you're like mentally consenting, but I don't know, like for me, it's just the experience is very real when you take that to the next level and actually prostrate. Just in the same thing, I was thinking like, we've all attended Orthodox services more than once. And there's a huge difference in something like that between sitting back as an observer and observing the service and actually participating in it. Like that kind of service is a very participatory service. There's all kinds of physical things that the people in the church are doing along with the priests, along with the prayers, along with everything.
Yeah.
Like for example, one thing that I notice is like every time the name of the Trinity is invoked in any context, people will cross themselves. And it's like, I imagine it's something like a sign of reverence for the name of the Holy Trinity. And my experience has been like, well, do it with them, and you will find that you are actually holding the Holy Trinity and the name of the Holy Trinity, like actually engaging in that physically showing that respect and honor to God, to the name of God, has a real effect on your thinking, has a real effect on your, I don't know, I guess you would say your soul.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of what we do in our conversations, and we approach things, as I was saying early in the opening words, we approach things with this sort of technical, theological, intellectual, abstract approach. Most of your spiritual life is not that and can't even be expressed in that way.
Right. But the other side is there's unfortunately not another way to express it.
Yeah, right.
Right. Like that's the thing that I run into oftentimes is like I'm trying to figure out how to express something that just can't be expressed.
Yeah. Well,
and so the two approaches are either this abstract philosophical language or just say like, well, just try it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, I was kind of thinking along the lines of, in my mind, symbolism is not very well understood. And part of the reason is because, well, this is really just the way that Western thought works.
Right.
But I'm an English teacher sometimes, and you go into an English class, and you will kind of get the idea that a symbol is a coded way of communicating an intellectual idea.
Yeah.
But in reality, the symbol is like intellectual ideas are built on a foundation of symbols.
Yeah.
The symbols are not some idea expressed in a secret way, but like there's something that's more significant and more foundational than the idea. And so I've mentioned that in the context of what you're saying about crossing yourself at the mention of the Trinity.
Oh, so you're a Catholic, huh?
Because it's going the wrong way.
Another discussion for another day, guys.
No, when I'm in the Orthodox Church services, if I'm going to cross myself, I always make sure to look at, because I know it goes the other direction. but just like try to do it the right way. All I had to look at here was you, and I guess I didn't have the same level of trust in you.
Right.
Anyways, you participate in it, in that action, not because it's like you're going to understand if you participate, but it's like participating in it is that thing itself. That's the actual goal.
Right.
I shouldn't say the actual goal, but I mean like that's more important than your intellectual understanding.
Yeah, which is like the divorce of modern Christianity, I guess you would say, from reality, is like we start separating Christianity from actual experience. We start separating it from something that you're actually engaging in. And so then, the way that you're going to reform your life is by listening to the right teachers, listening to the right sermons. In contrast to that, what Jesus says, the way you're going to reform your life is by worshiping me, and by praying to me, and then I'll transform you. But it's like this isn't an abstract concept in the mind of the people who received that teaching from Jesus and from his apostles. It's like it's an actual thing that you do. There's physical actions involved with it. If you're reading the Old Testament, it's obvious in the Old Testament there's physical actions at every step of the way in prayer and worship. There's even a lot of the words in Hebrew that we translate as prayer and worship involves some kind of physical action. Maybe it's lifting up your hands, or maybe it's bowing down, or maybe it's kneeling. I don't know, you'd know the Hebrew better than I would. But there's always a physical aspect to it, and it's the same in Greek for the most part.
Yeah.
But then you'll find that carried over. I guess this is starting to get a little bit into that philosophical realm, but you'll find that carried over in the apostolic fathers and all the way through the fathers and the saints of the church, is that prayer isn't I fold my hands and close my eyes and whisper something in my mind to God. That's not prayer in the mind of ancient Christians. That's not prayer in the minds of the apostles.
Well, I think in a sense it is, but it's
it's part of prayer.
It's like
but it's not
okay, so you get this idea, pray continually, and what that kind of opens up to you is that there are degrees of prayer.
Right.
There's the thing that you're doing when you're shutting your eyes and you're whispering something to God, and there's something else that happens as you're engaging in life that can still be a part of a prayer. But you're missing the top the top end of that spectrum. You can begin to see, there is a kind of spectrum of prayer, but it goes way beyond this spot that you're calling prayer.
Right. Yeah. Well, so there's this tendency in Western Christians, whether you're coming from a place of reacting to Roman Catholicism and what is seen as the empty rituals of Roman Catholicism, or if you're Anabaptist, if you're coming from Old Order Amish, the prayers, reciting prayers in German that you don't understand, and having this kind of ritual. It's go to the book and read the prayer, and that's how you pray about something. So that there can be this, this objection to ritual. But none of that is the sort of ritual that the Bible's talking about. Instead, it's just this engagement with God as if he were something real and actually present, on something that you can actually connect with. And so like, it's not like this Gnostic idea of prayer where God is detached from physical reality, and the only way you're going to pray is just in the mind or just in the emotions or whatever that might be.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is like some awareness coming back into Western Christianity. It's like, no, like actions in praise and prayer are actually a thing. And so you'll see people like trying to figure out, okay, what's going on with this whole raising your hands thing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I see that as overall a positive movement, even if, like some of the times it's like, okay, that's not maybe quite what the apostles were doing, but you're on the right track. So
Mhm.
like good for like, keep going that way.
Mhm.
I don't want to offer
Right.
criticism of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I sort of mentioned this before when it comes to prostration, that you have this idea that when you pray and maybe you bow your head a little bit, you have this idea that like, I'm bowing down before God.
Right.
And then when you actually like go down and put your head on the floor while you're praying, then there's, I mean, for me, there's like this revelation that, oh, I didn't know what it meant to bow before the Lord before I did that with my body.
Yeah.
And so like what that means also is that now when you bow your head down as a part of your prayer, that little action steps into something higher than it was before also, because I understand better what it means to bow than what I did, and what it means to bow in the presence of God than what I did in the past. So now like my heart knows what it means and knows how to do it, even when my full body isn't engaged in it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that reminds me of a couple weeks back when you came and spoke here for us at church,
Mhm.
and you were talking about what worship actually is.
Yeah, I'll mention that a little, and it's some of the comments that David was making about worship words. I mentioned the most common Greek word and the most common Hebrew word that are translated in English Bibles generally as worship don't mean worship, but in both languages the word is prostrate. But I didn't say the word prostrate. I said I'll show you what it means. And I stepped down from here and just got in the middle of the aisle and then bowed down before the cross here. And so demonstrated it rather than explaining the definition of the words.
Right.
And I don't know what the effect was, for the people watching. I mean, it's, interesting demonstration of a point. But for me, when I was there, bowing in the middle of the church, I felt like I wanted to just start crying. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it was a very powerful experience for me.
I didn't tell you that Sunday, but I did start crying when you
Yeah.
did that. Like, because it was very, it brought a meaning that wasn't, is not there. But it was.
Right, yeah.
Right.
I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah.
Well, so like there's this temptation, I should say, not tendency. There's this temptation that we have to think that when we become spiritual, we are no longer in need of the bodily things. I mean, I don't think Paul would have agreed with that, but I don't know. I think there's a danger of pride in that. It's like, well, I don't need to actually prostrate on the ground when I pray because I know in my heart that I've prostrated to God. It's like, well, I'm going to challenge you on that. Like, what have you got to lose? Try actually prostrating and you'll find out if you're actually bowing down before God or not.
Mhm.
Like when you
Right.
actually do the physical thing, then you'll learn where your heart actually is. And so like going back to the comment about like, why do I need these things? To me, it's like, you don't know if you need them or not, because they do actually teach you something. Like you said, when your example, actually doing the thing teaches something that talking about it can't. But like, it's the same for me in my own personal prayer. Me physically doing the thing teaches me something that just praying in my mind or praying in my heart can't.
Right.
And like the explanation for that is pretty simple. It's that you're not a soul that is trapped in a body.
Nothing works that way. Like,
Yeah.
if you're going to teach a kid how to throw a baseball, they got to actually throw a baseball with their body. Like,
Right.
I mean, you can give all the instruction, and you could write a book about the proper technique for throwing a baseball. but
Mhm.
but you don't know if you're doing it right until you actually do it.
Well, that's one of the frustrating things about reading like books about how sports were played back in like the late 1800s.
Yeah.
It's like all you have left is your imagination when you read their description of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, what, for instance, taking a step this way looked like then versus what we think it looks like now could have been totally different or something.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Yeah, so like, okay, take this to the next step, is that like that's also the danger in having a ideas-based version of Christianity.
Yeah.
That, like, here is the doctrines, here is what I'm explaining is right because I've studied the Bible and figured this all out. It's like, well, you don't know whether you're right or not because what you have is not based in experience.
Mm-hmm.
And like, to me, the scripture is pretty clear on this point, and so are like the saints of the church fathers, the witness of the church. Is like, if you want to be a Christian, forget about what you think you know and go and walk with the poor and feed the hungry and give everything that you have away. Like do these extreme acts of love and like live out your Christian life in a thorough and radical way. It's like, then you will learn what is real. Like, then the Bible will start to make sense because you're actually engaging in the things that it's talking about.
you know, one of the things you just said there, David, of the richness of the experience and drawing on the richness of the experience of the saints or the early church fathers. One of the things that I have been enjoying lately is reading some of the stories of saints in the Orthodox Church, or people that the Orthodox Church would refer to as saints. And some of them are more recent, maybe last 300 years. Some of them are maybe 600, 700, and then several of them that I was reading about were like over 1,200 years. But one of the things that was always interesting is that the portrayal of them and the way they practice was always the same all the way throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have the opportunity, or if people will visit a monastery, the monks there will show you the different stations of prayer and things, and they'll tell stories of people from 1,000 years ago praying at this station right here just like they pray today.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's one of the things about the practice that I'm describing, that Dave is describing, is that you do feel like there is some very, very ancient precedent for doing things that way.
Yeah, so like even something like having icons of saints, and having icons of, events in, maybe stories that happen in the Bible, like maybe the crucifixion or the resurrection or Pentecost or whatever it might be, or even like events that happened in later church history. Like, the reason you have those icons is because you're engaging in the lived experience of God, not the ideas, the teachings, the abstract concepts. It's like, no, here's a person who walked with God and lived with God, and very often it's somebody who died for God.
Right.
It's like who sealed his faith with his own blood. Or here is something that actually happened in history where God worked salvation in the world.
Yeah.
It's like you're engaging with Christianity as if it's a real thing that has happened in the lives of those that have come before us and is happening now. Like that also ties in with this concept of like prayer and worship being entering into this, like, I don't know, time outside of time, this heavenly time. It's just that idea. Like, this sounds like a really strange abstract concept, but really the idea behind it, I think, is something like God is at work now and always. And it's always the same God at work in the same way. He's constant, he's reliable, he can be trusted. And so what that means for you practically is you can look at St. George or St. Basil or St. John Chrysostom or St. Paul or any of these figures, or even the prophets in the Old Testament. Like, you can look at any of these figures and see, here is how God works. and I can see that in their lives.
Right.
And because I have an actual example to look at, then I can understand what God's talking about. And it's the same thing, like that's part of your prayer, is when you're praying to God, you're not relating to an abstract concept. You're not relating to the God of philosophy, which I think is like what a lot of Christians are doing, but they don't realize it. Their God is the God of philosophy. He's an idea that they have in their head, but he's not someone who is actually standing in front of them and is present in their life. But like when I have an icon of Jesus, it's not that I need an icon of Jesus, and I can't be a Christian if I don't have an icon of Christ. And it's also not that I am praying to the paint and the wood. Like, no, you're not. You're praying to Jesus, but having that image that you can look at with your eyes and engage with physically it helps you to realize that Christ walked the earth. Like, this isn't just a story that I was told as a child. This is a thing that actually happened. And this work of Christ is something that is actually happening. Mm-hmm. It's not an idea. It's a real, present, living thing. Yeah. And like, ultimately what it comes down to is that's why you need ritual, and that's why you need an altar. That's why you need to physically bow down and physically participate in prayer and worship, is because God is real and is really at work in the world, in physical things.
Yeah, I think for me, I've always had this idea that whatever is true faith, it's something that has to be able to exist if you're living in a cave and hiding from people that are persecuting you.
Yeah.
It has to be able to exist in poverty and in suffering. When you don't have all these things, and you're saying, well, here's the reason you need these things. But like all those things that you're saying, they're all present in the person who's hiding in a cave because of his faith. Like if that's you, if you're living in this situation where you've been stripped of everything, then in a sense, like,
well,
you're walking in the footsteps of Christ.
Right, as I was going to say, you don't need the things there helping you engage in God's work. Right. Like, you're actually doing it.
I mean, you're one way or the other, whether it's through ritual or whether it's through suffering, persecution, you're participating in it with your body.
Yeah, so I mean, the scenario you described there, John, of someone being persecuted and hiding in a cave or whatever.
He's definitely a living icon.
Yeah, and you can pretty easily, see the representation of Christ in what you're experiencing.
Yeah,
right.
Right.
Yeah, and it's like that's some of the comments we got when we were talking about icons, is that like, okay, so you have monks who live in caves or monks who live in like a hermetic cell, mm-hmm. and they don't have icons in those cells because, I don't know that you would say because they don't need them, but it's just like, I think it's the same concept. It's like, no, because they
have them.
Yeah, like they have them.
Right.
Like they're living out the icons.
Yeah.
And so it's like, for me personally in my daily life, like, am I living out the story of God that thoroughly? If I'm not, then it's probably very wise of me to have a way that I can engage with those who did or those who are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So far, I'm sort of almost through the second question that I have here.
So we got like, what, 5 to go?
I actually wanted to return to Aaron's a little bit because I had asked why did you decide to take up this practice of having a home altar or a personal shrine or prayer corner or whatever? Like, why did you decide to take up this practice? And he gave his answer, but I wanted to add one other thing that you'd mentioned to me in the past. You had told me that it wasn't because you understood this and you didn't study it a lot, and it was important to you to not have that intellectual approach going into it, but just to say, hey, mm-hmm. I don't know what it's all about. I'm going to start this practice and see what it's all about. And if you have a comment, then go ahead and jump in. Otherwise, I'll turn to. Go ahead.
Just the thing to add to what I think, the other thing I might have said to you is that it just seemed the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And that's And I think I also said I can't really explain that to you.
Yeah, right. Well, that is actually a pretty good way to live your life, is like when you're pretty sure that something's the right thing to do, then you can't worry too much about understanding it perfectly. I mean, like I think of like getting married as being an example of this. Like, you're not going to understand marriage. You're not going to know what you're getting into. You're not going to know what your life is like.
Yeah.
So forget the idea that you're going to intellectually understand it, and like open your eyes up to, is this good?
Yeah.
Or is this not good? And if it's good, then go for it.
Don't like it when people try to explain all the reasons why this person is the right one. It's like,
Yeah.
no, don't do that.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious. But like even like
Yeah, like you're trying to justify the come up with a rationalization for why you should get married to the person.
Yeah,
Well, it needs to be built on something other than a rational foundation.
Yeah, an even better example of that is also like salvation and baptism. It's like there are a lot of people out there who have this notion that, well, you have to understand salvation in order for it to be real. And it's like, I'm sorry, you will never understand salvation.
Mm-hmm.
It is so far beyond human capacity. You will never understand.
Right.
So if your salvation is hinged on your understanding and your knowledge, then you are doomed to hell. Like, I'm sorry, there's just no way around that. But instead, what salvation is you, like you said, you recognize this is a good thing, and I choose to trust God with my life. And so that means that I can be saved. Like, and that's why it is that, like, Paul says you're saved by grace through faith. Because that faith is like, you know what? I can trust God. And so I'm going to. I don't have to understand it. I don't have to know it. It's not my knowledge that's going to save me. It's not my discipline that's going to save me. It's not any of these things. It's God's grace.
Mm-hmm.
It's not me saying that I believe something.
Yeah, but like it's the same thing in prayer, is that, so there's all kinds of different ways that we can go about dealing with our issues of life. And for me, like what it comes down to is the Bible says, Jesus says, hey, don't worry about it, trust me. And prayer is the act of, don't worry about it, trust me. Prayer is the act of, I'm going to let go of all of these things, all of my wisdom concerning the subject, all of the advice that other people are giving me, all of that, and I'm going to let go of it and trust you with my life. And what that means is I've got to actually cultivate this relationship with you. And going back to like the physical practice is, you're engaging with Christ as if he's a real person. And so like that's why I bow down before Christ, is because Christ is the actual king. Mm-hmm. He's not a king of ideas. Like he's not the best idea. It's like, no, he's an actual person who is actually king. Mm-hmm. And you bow down before a king. And I guess you want me to answer the question.
Well, I mean, you've gone around it a little bit.
Yeah, but I think there's a very simple,
go for it.
Straightforward answer for me. Is for me.
Yeah, why did you take up the practice of the home altar?
Yeah, so for me, my goal in life is I want to be a saint. And what that means is I'm going to take up everything. I'm going to do everything I can to become a saint. And part of that is, what I already said, God's the one who's going to make me a saint. So that means engaging with him as thoroughly as possible. But then also it's like I have the example of all of these other people who lived and died before me who are actually saints. And I'm going to listen to their advice because it worked for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Enough said.
Okay, I do want to, this will be a little tangent that won't connect a whole lot to other things that we'll say in here. But Aaron mentioned that this practice of a personal shrine is a little unusual for Mennonites, but
modern Mennonites.
Yeah, you did say modern. That's true. You were careful with
Important distinction there.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you can, if you want to, you can go online and you can buy an icon of Dirk Willems. And for people watching the video, mostly won't know, but he's the principal Anabaptist saint. And it's always kind of been an interesting thing for me that while our tradition kind of keeps a distance from icons, everybody knows the picture of Dirk Willems. I mean, everybody who's an Anabaptist knows this picture. And this is a man who was fleeing persecution, again, for the sake of the viewers. He ran across a frozen lake to try to get away from the people that were chasing him. His pursuer fell through the ice, and he turned around and went back on the ice and pulled the guy out. And then, as a result of this, he was arrested and he was killed.
See, I would just say that I know the picture better than I know the name.
Yeah, like the picture of this guy reaching to
Yes.
somebody falling through the ice.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And like I say, you can buy an icon of Dirk Willems. I mean, it's obviously nobody except Anabaptists is going to want this, and nobody except Anabaptists is going to make it. So Anabaptists are making and selling religious icons. It does happen.
Right.
Making and buying, or maybe I should say, but so it is part of practice in modern Mennonites. But then I think I want to just turn it over to you, because I think you'll have more of the sense of like what's the role of this home altar practice in the Mennonite or Anabaptist world.
Yeah, I would say like it is kind of mixed. Like on the one hand, we were talking about this before the conversation. It's like I've heard sermons preached about the importance of having a home altar, like having an actual place, like even it's just like a little table set aside in your living room for you to pray. Or, we'll talk a lot about having a prayer closet. I think a lot of people I know probably have a prayer closet.
Yeah.
It's just like, they just have a little closet where they go to pray. There might not be an actual altar or something, and I don't know. I think they're usually fairly private things, and like, you don't like go on a tour and somebody shows off their prayer closet.
Yeah, right.
And the idea there being like, Jesus saying, when you pray, go into your closet and pray privately. So like these are all practices that exist, like whether it's having an actual table, or whether it's having a room, like a little closet set aside. Like it's not a universal thing. There are very few universal things among Mennonites, though. So that's not,
Yeah.
It's not a universal thing, but a lot of people I know have something like that, or at least recognize the value of it.
Yeah.
Now, what I would say is I would go a step further and point out what an altar is. So like this goes back to our argument about whether it's a shrine or an altar.
Yeah.
So like an altar specifically is a table for the offering of a sacrifice. And so like this is, when it comes down to it, like why I would say you should have an actual altar to pray is because prayers are a sacrifice. And like what you're doing, like if you're praying properly, what you are doing is offering a sacrifice of praise and a sacrifice of yourself. Like you're like David says in the Psalms, your broken and contrite heart. You're offering that as a sacrifice to God. And so it's useful to like have an actual altar for that sacrifice. Now, I think I would also tie into that. It's not going to be an acceptable offering if, that offering hasn't been cleansed of its defilement. So don't think that's the only sacrifice involved in Christianity. And it's like some people do, but like if you read the very early church fathers, you will find it pretty explicitly stated this is not a right way of thinking. I'll leave that there for now. I just want to throw that in there just for the point of saying I'm not advocating that your prayer is the only sacrifice that is acceptable to God. Like it's a sacrifice, but it's not the only one. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay, a minute ago when I said that we were partway through my second question, there was a little bit of an inside joke for me on that because we covered a lot of these other things. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions that you've mostly talked about just to see if there's anything that you want to include that you haven't mentioned so far.
It's not fair that you would have jokes and not include the rest of it.
Well, you laughed at it. But one was just to describe your practice, and you kind of covered that. I think especially Aaron, what he goes, when you're talking about the place for confession, And then you're also this your sort of selfish prayers that you get out of the way before you go to the altar, and then you have this prayer that's directed toward God. And I think you can find a lot of go online and you can read a bunch of articles, Protestant articles about how to pray. And they'll have like, do these 7 things, when you sit down and pray or whatever, there'll be some number like do this and this and this.
Yeah.
And
I thought it was 6.
well, there's, different authors will come up with different numbers. And so, you have like your prayer of petitions and your prayer of thanksgiving and your prayer of proclamations or whatever, like your prayer of praise. So, you just all these different things that prayer can do. But it's like, it's a list of words, like that's supposed to be the thing that guides your prayer. And if somebody's list can serve as a guide for your prayer, to me, it does seem like it's a step above that to say like, all right, this is going to be the spot where I do this, and then this is going to be the spot where I can do this, because then it's all coded into your body and your environment. It's not just a list, it's not just words that go into your head, but it's like the whole world around you is telling you how to pray.
Yeah, exactly.
And I went on a little tangent there, but I wanted to ask, was there anything else that you guys want to include about how do you go about your practice?
Yeah, so I guess Aaron mentioned something about he has a separate table for confession. I do too, and it's actually in a separate room. And my idea there, so like me, I have a separate little table, like I guess you could say a second altar, it's actually like in my living room, and there's a cross on it, and above it is an icon of Christ the Good Shepherd. So if you're not familiar, that's an icon of Christ carrying a sheep, and like the icon also specifically demonstrates the nail holes in Christ's hands. So like it is Aaron actually bought it for me as a gift, I think.
Yeah, I think I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah, so like I have that, and what that often is, I'm not always faithful in doing it the right way, but like the idea there is that this, going on what I said about the acceptable sacrifice, this is my place where I make my confession to God, and where I ask for God's forgiveness for my sins and my sinfulness. With the idea that, okay, I'm going to make a separation that here's the everyday altar, and it's in the place of my everyday life. And I don't bring that into the holy place, into the sanctuary of God.
Right.
I go to the sanctuary to worship and to pray to God. And like before that, like this is the ideal practice that doesn't always happen. But before that, it's like deal with the filth and corruption of sin and in the taint of the world. I guess you could say like go to Christ and let him wash your feet.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And then go into the sanctuary. And so like it's the same thing, like you have the basin outside of the sanctuary of the temple. The priests, before they go into the sanctuary of the temple, have to wash themselves, and that's a symbol of repentance. So it's like, this is my place of repentance. So I have my acts of repentance. And then I go in, and like I also have like my altar, there's not much on my altar. There's just a cross and some candles. And then I have a separate table on the opposite wall of the room where I have like my scriptures and my psalms and some prayer books and things like that. Just for the purpose of keeping my altar, I guess, uncluttered.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the things I'll add about we've talked about David just talked about the idea of an altar of cleansing or confession or whatever. The idea for me is that when you go to the holy altar of removing oneself, is that one of the rules that I try to keep when I go to that altar is that I don't ever pray for things for me at that altar. I will pray for the sick, I will pray for the church, our churches, I will pray for, our nation, our leaders, things like that. But they're never prayers that are about me. They are prayers that are about beyond myself and things like that. Simply because like that, what you just described a little bit ago, it's important to keep that distinction because you want to make it a place where you are removing you from everything.
Right.
And that is when you can start to receive the, how do I want to say this? Maybe this might be kind of a dangerous word for some people, but that is when you can receive the mystical power of Christ.
Yeah. Well, like for me, it's like I kind of try to pattern, and I'm not saying like this is the only way that I ever pray. It's like, I will also do the sort of prayer that everybody else does. But like my deep prayer, this kind of thing that we're talking about with the altar, is like I've kind of tried to look at the book of Exodus and the tabernacle. I mean, I guess also Leviticus. There's a lot in there about what's going on in the tabernacle. But so like looking at the Torah and the description of the tabernacle and looking at that as, among many other things, a model of prayer. And so like there's this, I don't know, like these concentric circles, like this court within a court, this holy place within a holy place, within another holy place, within a holy city, within a holy nation. So it's like this degrees of holiness until you get to the holiest of all, where God, like the presence of God is. And just like understanding, it's like, okay, when you come to the outer courts of the temple, none of the people, none of the animals, none of the stuff of your everyday life is allowed past the outer gate of the temple or of the tabernacle. You come to the door with your sacrifice and give it to the priest, but you never go past that. And then the priest, before they can enter into the sanctuary, like what I mentioned already, there's their rituals that they have to go through, especially the thing with washing, which, like I mentioned already, is repentance. And then there's the coming into the inner courts. And there's also like the incense, and I don't know, like I put a big emphasis also on the fact that in the sanctuary is also where the priest eat the bread and the meat of the sacrifice. And like the symbol there is, this is where God's priests, God's holy people, are being fed with the holy things of the altar.
Yeah.
And like that's what's happening in prayer. God is feeding you. In Christianity, what God is feeding you is ultimately himself, and that's what's symbolized in the Eucharist. But like having this concept in my mind and how I structure my prayer is just like this increasing holiness of, I don't know, the layers of prayer. Yeah. I don't know, like the concept I have is that most people never make it past the outer court of the temple. I don't know if that's fair. Maybe I'm being overly harsh, but like just reflecting on myself and my own prayer life.
I have this impression that there are people, lots of people that are still living today. We heap a lot of condemnation on the older generations.
Yeah.
I mean, whether people that are 60 or 70 years old now, or whether people that are 80 or 90 years old, like we look back on those people, we can think about like, well, when it comes to Christianity, they got this wrong and they got this wrong and they get this wrong. And I have a lot of experience with older people, and one thing that I'm constantly struck by is these people pray way more than the people that are complaining about them.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
And so I think there's something to what you're saying about people not getting into this, not getting beyond that outer court. But I think also we sort of, at least in the interest of crossing the generational lines, we close our eyes to where people are going beyond that, because there's something about them that we don't like.
You're right. Yeah, and I guess I'm not trying to say that people don't pray enough, or even that people's prayers aren't real. I'm just trying to say, what if there's more? What if there's, God has given us access to more than that? And so like you have this whole idea in Christianity, Christ has rent the veil of the temple and given us access, immediate access to God. And I look at that sometimes and think, like, we all understand that as a concept, but are we ever actually going to the Holy of Holies.
Mm-hmm.
And if we are, like, do we treat this as like, oh, now I can just go to the Holy of Holies whenever I want? It's like, no, you cannot. Like,
Yeah.
you will be destroyed. Like, this will not be good for you. If you go into the holy place defiled by sin, like, the holiness of God will just burn you up.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe that's to your point about people not going beyond that outer court of the temple, is that it probably would be fair to say that, well, maybe I shouldn't even say a lot of people. Maybe I can just say, hey, it's a very real thing that can happen.
Yeah.
That you can say the veil is rent and I'm entering into the Holy of Holies when you're not entering the Holy of Holies.
Right, and I guess ultimately the point for me is, like, I'm not really trying to look at other people
Right, that's
and
why
be
I say,
critical
like,
of them.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
trying to look at myself
Yeah,
and say,
that's why I say it's a real thing that can happen. I'm
Right.
not interested in this idea of a lot of people do this and let's just condemn everybody else.
Yeah.
But say, like, okay, I think that's a real pattern. You can say,
Mhm.
hey, we can just go into the Holy of Holies, and we're not actually going there.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, like, God prevents you out of his mercy.
Yeah.
I think it's an accurate thing to say. Like, he doesn't want you to be destroyed by his holiness. You see that pattern repeatedly in the Old Testament. It's like God withdraws so that Israel or the world or whoever it is just not consumed. I was going to say something else and I forgot what it was.
Okay, that's fine. I'll jump in and just try to draw a few things together here. In these restored prayer practices, we mentioned when we were talking about prostration, then you mentioned sometimes you're not even using words. And there's this
Which
idea.
reminded me of the thing I was going to
Okay.
say. We're going to talk about the noose a little bit.
There's this notion, like, that people seem to have, that, like, that there's a prayer without words that's better than the prayer where Jesus will talk about using your many words and thinking that you'll be heard because of your many words. And it does give this impression, like, if you can strip those words away, then there's something that's richer than all of that. But how to access that? How do you get to this point of that sacred prayer without words?
Right.
Well, bow down before God.
Yeah.
Like, then it's not that hard to be in that place.
Yeah, well,
if you're just going to sit there and bow your head and just say, like, okay, here I am in a prayer with no words. I think it's just a lot easier, again, like, get down on the floor.
Right.
And then you can be in that place. You're not, I think you're receiving from God when you're prostrated before God. But
Yeah.
you're not asking, you're not, like, trying to pull some favors or something. What you're trying to do is find the right place for you in the universe. Like,
Well, it's like-
put yourself properly beneath God. And, like, I mean, to me, that seems like that's the goal of that. I don't know if I should say the goal, but, like, that's part of the experience of that prayer of prostration is, look, I'm not asking for anything. I'm just trying to put myself in the place that I'm supposed to be.
Right. So, like, I spent some time among Buddhist monks, like, not with the goal of, like, learning to be a Buddhist or anything like that. But, like, in Buddhism, for Buddhist monks, it's like their whole goal is to learn to meditate without thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
which is like there is a good principle there. Even if they're doing it for the wrong reasons, they're misguided in
Yeah,
practice.
well, I mean, you find very similar things in Christian.
Yeah,
tradition.
and I know, and I'm just,
Yeah.
and I'm bringing out the example of Buddhism because I think most people are aware that this is what Buddhists are trying to do.
Mhm.
And the reason I bring that up also is that, like, Buddhists over the thousands of years have developed all of these techniques to try to silence the mind, to try to, like, get rid of, like, the chaos of thought that's keeping you from meditating.
Mhm.
Now, in Christianity, you're after something different. You're not after silence. You're after contemplation and also hearing God. It's like Buddhists are not trying to hear anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're trying to be in a state just free of thought. And my experience has been that none of them ever actually accomplish it.
Yeah, right.
Like, they say somebody who does is enlightened and then just kind of stops being.
Yeah.
That's, I know, a little bit of a maybe unfair paraphrase, but anyway, like just the point being, like, there's all these people all over the world in all these different religions. I think there's something similar in Hinduism. Like they're after like this thoughtless meditation. And like for us as Christians, I think oftentimes there's the same thing at work. Like we're trying to figure out how can we do the same thing that Buddhists are doing and sit there and not think. And I almost want to say that's a misguided approach in some ways, at least.
Mhm.
That like what we're not after like silent prayer without words isn't actually prayer without thought, or prayer without any of the mind at work. What we're really after, like I mentioned, is the nous, which I don't know, that's kind of a hard word. That's a Greek word. It's in the Bible, and you'll find it a lot in Greek Christian writings, like throughout the history of the church. It's kind of hard to pin it down in English exactly what it means. You know, like one way somebody might describe it is the heart of the mind, or some might call it like the receptive intellect.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like the nous is the part of you that speaks to God. You know, if you know anything about like neuroscience, you can think of the nous as being like really similar to it's at the right hemisphere of the brain,
Mm-hmm.
which is like the listening part of the brain. It's like that's like religion exists in the right hemisphere of the brain. It's
Mhm.
like what I'm saying is like there's actually, I would say, a physical reflection of the spiritual reality. Like you have your part of your mind, your left brain, that is really rational, analytical, breaks things down into concepts and ideas, and you have this other part that is receptive.
and you could say like in most of the ways that people talk about prayer, we're talking about a left brain sort of thing.
Yeah.
Like, all right, I mean, even just the idea of like, we'll take everybody's prayer requests and then we'll make a list of prayer requests and then we'll systematically go through the list one item at a time until we reach the end of it. You know, I mean, like it's just a very analytical, systematic, rational approach to things.
Yeah, and borrowing from my knowledge of Ian McGilchrist, I would suggest that if you have this idea that prayer is only this mental prayer of, you know, going through all these steps and praying all of these things, then your left brain has tyrannical control over you.
Yeah,
And
right.
you're like, your
Right.
mental state is deeply unstable.
Yeah, I think another thing with the like make the list of prayer requests, it does frame the idea that prayer is about taking your petitions to God.
Mhm.
And I mean I deliberately use that phrase just to highlight that, okay, this is a biblical idea of prayer, but if that's the way that you are approaching it, then the idea, well, I mentioned like, you know, you will find Protestants who will say that praise of God is part of your prayer.
Right.
But you're not going to praise God when you're going through an item by
Right.
item list of prayer requests. Like the prayer request list has,
Yeah, which is like,
it is blind to that.
You're not
And so
getting on
the
this
thing
very
that you're
much.
practicing regularly in the church, what's that?
I said, Aaron's not getting in on this.
The thing that you're practicing in the church becomes a model for prayer,
Yeah.
and it's all about, you know, it's
Here's what
these
you
things
do.
that you
Here's
can
the
understand with
technique,
your
here's the-
mind. It's these things that you can like push toward God. Like, all right, here's the things. Now take care of them.
Yeah.
And that receptive part of the self is
Yeah.
not present in it.
Well,
Yeah.
that is something that has always bothered me, of that, you know, for me growing up, that's all the prayer meeting was
Mhm,
on a
mhm.
Wednesday night
Yeah.
was, you know, God, here are these different things we're pushing towards you, take care of them, now let's go home and have some ice cream or something like
Yeah,
that.
right,
You know?
right.
Yeah, but
And-
there's no like coming into the sanctuary and being fed from the altar.
Right. And it's always been that idea for me too, is that, well, there has to be more to prayer than just this, because
Mhm.
someone could just look at that and say, well, what kind of God is that? Like, somebody could easily just sit and say to me, well, you're just praying to that wall over there or something like that. There's nothing real to that.
Yeah.
And so all that a lot of people are left with is to try to rationally make the case for their God.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't work very well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have more questions?
Yeah, just a couple. And another one of these is one that you've largely covered that I'll go ahead and ask in case there's anything else that you want to add to this. And I'm not asking you guys to make a sales pitch for a prayer corner or having an altar in your house, but just sort of your honest assessment of what has this practice meant to you.
Something more real.
Yeah.
Well, and I alluded to it earlier, realizing that the world is much bigger or things are much bigger than just me.
I think for me, it's kind of what I said already. It's like you'll figure out that Jesus is a real person, and you can have an actual conversation with him. And like that might sound almost like I've gone insane to some people, but like no, like that's.
But that's what we're supposed to believe as Christians. Though.
Right. But like, are we engaging with him as if he is real and actually present?
Right.
Yeah.
Or are we engaging with him as if he is only a concept in our minds?
Yeah.
Right. And you just mentioned the idea of the nous, the receptive intellect. The part of the mind or of the spirit that is receiving from God. Go.
I mean, I didn't quite even get to this in like my breakdown of my practice of prayer, but most of my prayer when I get into that place will consist of like, out loud. It actually is important to do things out loud. I think we've already covered that ground, why, but like out loud reciting or even singing psalms.
Yeah.
Or, there might be a few certain prayers, like the Lord's Prayer, for example, or some other prayers that, maybe saints long ago wrote down and they're just particularly good. And like that doesn't make sense unless that you understand that the goal is to open your mind, open the nous, to be receptive to God. Like to me, like that's what I'm doing. So I'm engaging in worship, this worshipful prayer, this sacrifice of prayer in order to receive from God, like to truly receive.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it is this, I don't know, like nous is just the best way to describe it, this noetic prayer, this like I'm not just going through the motions for the sake of I'll go through the motions and then I've done my thing and now I'm good. It's like no, there's an actual goal, and the goal is to come to the presence of God, let God teach me, speak to me, and change me. Like feed me with himself.
Yeah.
Like he is the food that sustains your soul.
Yeah, just I was just going to say that like that receptive part of yourself is like if you have any relationship with beauty, then it comes through that.
Yeah.
And when I reference beauty, then I have in mind the bride of Christ. The beauty of the church is something that comes when the church receives from God, and it's something that's lost when the church is no longer receiving. So I mean, you could say like when you have that when your approach toward prayer is just get the items on the list and then systematically go through each item there, and you're not bringing this receptive spirit into the prayer, then you're not engaged with the beauty. You're not receiving from God.
Right.
That's not the bride of Christ at work.
Yeah.
There's something that goes along with being that bride that is absent in that process.
Yeah. Exactly.
I guess my sale pitch would though be like, don't just treat this.
Oh yeah,
like-
this will be, I'll just go ahead and ask the last question and then you can give your sales pitch, which is just what's your advice to other people? So that's.
Yeah, so that is my
that's the
sales
invitation
pitch.
to
Yeah,
sales
so
pitch.
so don't just treat this as like an interesting conversation. Do the things that we're saying, what we're talking about. Because like, what do you have to lose? Like, do you actually have a reason not to do it? Like, please just try it. Engage in it. Do these things. Trust the saints of God who became saints through doing these things. Do it and try it for yourself rather than trying to figure out if there's something to what we're saying. Like you'll only know through participation, through actually doing it. That's the only way you're going to know.
Okay, Aaron, you have some bits of advice?
I would say to add to what David said, yes, be willing to try something different, but also be willing to open yourself up to something to an experience that has never been part of your walk with God. Like, realize that there's more there. There is more than just, practically going through these motions that we've kind of all been used to in Western Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And that there is really, it's a little we're not so used to the word mystical in the West, but there is a more mystical experience with Christ. There is.
Mm-hmm.
It's there to be, for us to be part of.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of what mystical means, and maybe you have your own definition, but I think part of what mystical means is you're participating in the symbols, and when you participate in the symbols, your identity is changed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
Right.
It's something beyond. It's something beyond the solidity of this table or whatever you want to say, or these objects are sitting here in this room. It's something beyond that.
Yeah, it's like we could go on and on and on for another 3 hours talking about this and trying to explain.
Let's do.
Well, we could do that, and we could try to explain what we're talking about. I mean, it's just the same thing with Christianity in general. Like, I get the impression there's a lot of people that are frustrated. It's like we've been going around and around and around our whole lives for generations talking about these things and trying to figure out what's right. And it's just, you're never going to know until you step outside of your comfort zone, until you step into something. Like, if you have a sense that there's something lacking, consider trying something new that you haven't tried before. But like, you're never going to know until you do it.
I would also say, to kind of summarize what you just said there, David, stop trying to figure things out.
Yeah.
Like, that has been one of the most important things in this stuff that we've been talking about in my practice and our altars and things, is reminding myself daily to stop trying to figure things out.
Yeah.
Because there are things that we all face in life that we desperately would like to find answers for.
Yeah.
And when I have found myself literally battling those things and trying to find answers, I lose and lose and lose and lose and over again.
Right.
But this experience of taking myself and placing myself at the altar and letting go of all of that, letting go of all my preconceived notions and the way I think things should work, the way I think things should work out.
Right.
You can begin to see the world in a different way.
This, related to figuring things out, this has been on my mind through the whole conversation, but I haven't mentioned it, but it's like the role of the will in all of this. Because I think, in a sense, when you have the ritual practice, then you can you can let go, and you can just practice it because it's part of a ritual. You can just do the thing. When you don't have that, then your prayer life is like, okay, I'm going to be a good prayer. I'm going to do a good job at this, and I'm going to do it all the time. And I'm not going to have a ritual practice or anything, but I'm just like through my own will and determination, I'm going to be good at this.
Yeah.
And then, weeks go by, and it's like, I just don't have a good prayer life, and I want it to be better than it is, and I just need to try harder. And it does seem to me that with the practice you're describing, you don't have to try in that same like muster up the will.
Yeah, right.
So that I can be like this self-directed spiritual giant.
Well, to put into practical, sorry, David, just real
Oh, I was just
quickly.
going to say the self-directed part is like, that's the key, is you're not the one that's directing it.
Yeah.
Like one thing I've been trying to figure out how to get at is like, the goal is ultimately that when I come to God in prayer, there's actually nothing of myself left.
Right.
Like it's God who's in charge.
Yeah, and to put into more maybe a little more practical terms, what you just described, John, with the will, is if someone has a certain sin that they are struggling with, don't set the goal that you are not going to commit that sin.
Yeah.
Set the goal that you are going to pray more and draw closer to God more. That is the idea. That could be more of a down-to-earth idea of how you could picture what you're actually doing there, is that you are realizing that I'm not going to change that on my own.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what
It's Christ that's going to change it.
That's what Paul's saying when he says, like, by grace you're saved through faith, not your own works.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Porphyrios was the name, but I'd come across this quote recently that you don't become a saint by fighting against evil. You become a saint by focusing on God.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like, I guess my other piece of advice is look at the example of people who you can trust, people who have proven the value of their philosophy. And there's a fairly good chance it's not somebody around you right now. Like, and I don't mean that to be, you should be a jerk and you're better than everybody else around you, but just what I mean by that is it's God's saints. It's the people who died for their faith, or who changed the world through their faith. The people whose example you know that you can trust because God proved himself through them.
Yeah.
And so like you can look at this person and say, I can trust this guy. And so I'm going to take him at his word and follow their advice.
Yeah.
Okay, now there is one way in which this advice is leaves the question of how do I implement this, because it's all sort of abstract and like motivational and encouragement and like just take this attitude into it.
Yeah.
But if there's somebody who's in a position where they're thinking, I would like to have this sort of a practice. I don't have any icons. I don't have a spare room in my house, that I can devote to this or whatever. Or just somebody who, for whatever reason, doesn't know how or where to begin with this practice. Then what would you say to that person?
I don't know, do you have a cross on a wall somewhere, or even just a corner of a room, or a coffee table,
Or even
just,
do you have maybe you could get yourself a hold of a little even cardboard card of Christ,
or even just a pocket cross. Or
That's where I started, was just a little image of Christ, and or a little icon of Christ, and it's.
Or do you just have a spot in the middle of the room where you can just bow down and prostrate yourself, even if you don't have a cross or a picture of Christ or something like that?
Right.
Because it's not that you necessarily have to have those things.
Right. Or maybe sometimes when you pray, bring yourself to cross yourself.
Right.
Maybe try that a few times and see what your experience is like. Don't rush into something. I will say this about my experience, is I rushed out and bought a bunch of icons at one time and set them all up, and I remember the first time I invited David into my home, and he was like, well, that's on the wrong side, and that's not facing Christ the way it should be. And I was like, oh. So I had no idea what I was doing. So it's
Very
like
discouraging of you.
Yeah, I was just so critical to me.
Well, it was also indicative of the fact that I kind of didn't know what I was doing either. So, you know, it's okay to do some research. I told John before we had our conversation here.
Okay, but let's explain that a little bit. It's like it's not that there's a way that things have to be and this is
Correct.
the only right way.
Right.
It's instead that, if you're using icons or images or something from a tradition, they are put together with a certain sort of symbolic language in mind.
Right.
And they actually do teach you and speak to you better if they're arranged
Correct.
properly.
Yeah.
Like that's what we're getting at. And I was like, oh no, you are technically incorrect, and therefore
You're going to hell, or
Right.
you're a pagan or something.
Right.
No, but I told John before we started, if you get on Google and Google Orthodox home altars, you will get an array of different approaches to a home altar.
Mm-hmm.
All of them do have Christ at the center of it, though. And that's kind of the idea.
But
So-
you can also just read the Bible and look at the examples of Abraham putting together just a pile of rocks,
Yeah.
or
Yeah, you
Like-
probably do that.
yeah,
I mean,
Yeah.
you really could actually.
Yeah.
I mean, because you know what it's there for.
Right.
you don't have to we're not I don't think you should hear things
Or
as
there's also this, I mean, maybe this is what you're going to say, but there's this attitude that some people have of well, everything is sacred, so nothing in particular has to be sacred.
Yeah.
But
That's-
this is sort of what I was describing, something similar when I said, well, the close your eyes and whisper your prayer to God, that is a real prayer, and you pray in everything, pray without ceasing, indicates that is a certain place on a spectrum, and that there's other stuff up here. And if you go up here and you actually physically prostrate yourself before God, then that changes your understanding of what does it mean for your heart to bow before God. And now this prayer is changed. The prayer where you're just closing your eyes and whispering your prayers to God, that is something different. And it's something different because you had the experience of the deeper sacredness
right.
of that other prayer.
Yeah,
And
so-
so if you're going to say everything is sacred, well, you don't know what that means unless some things are particularly sacred.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you're putting a pile of rocks together, that may seem like, well, that's sort of arbitrary. What's so special about these rocks? Well, what's special about them is you said, I'm going to put these rocks here, and the reason that I'm going to put these rocks here is because this is going to be my home altar.
Yeah.
That's what makes those rocks sacred.
And it's
because
your
it's
home
dedicated to
altar.
God.
Your home altar should be something that you know, and that those that come into your home or see it know that is a sacred set apart place.
Yeah.
That's a
Well-
good place to start.
Well, so I just want to say briefly, in response to that, everything is sacred, or the temple of God is every one of us, or we're all, God is not worshipped in a house made with hands, and this kind of language, which is all true.
Mhm.
But look at the prophetic language, the prophetic vision of the age that's to come, the resurrection. What you have is you'll have this symbol in the prophets that the words Yahweh is salvation will be written on every cow and every animal. So it's saying everything is sacred because that is what was written on the thing that the high priest wore on his head. So it's like that. This is the person who's the representation of God's holiness, being put on the world. And then the prophetic language that's going to be even on the most common animal, and the fork and the spoon, and everything is holy. But in that prophetic vision, there is still a holy city and a holy temple and a place where God is. So even in a world where things are holy, even just look at the city of Jerusalem itself is a holy city, and then there's a temple in Jerusalem that is even holier than the city. And then there's courts within the temple that there's this progression of holiness.
Mm-hmm.
So to say that everything is holy and everything is sacred doesn't mean that the hierarchy of holiness is eliminated entirely.
Mhm,
Like that
right.
image is not present in the prophets.
Yeah. Well, I think also there's like, if you're going to say, this is really the same point that I was making earlier and that you're making there, but if you're going to say that every person is a temple, you got to know what a temple is.
Yeah,
like
right.
that is empty language unless you have experience of the temple. And if you're
Right.
going to say like, well, our prayers are the incense. Okay, what's incense? Like,
Yeah, like actually, like if you're critical of incense, like try praying with it sometime, and I think your criticisms will disappear.
Yeah.
Like I'm convinced that that's true, and like you have to be willing to like not sit there and like question it and try to figure out like why is this a real thing, or
Mhm.
like look at it critically.
Right. Yeah, and as I said, that's the same point I was making
Or
before.
try to
I
figure out
used-
why it's a real. Well, I guess I said that.
Yeah, I use bowing as the example. Like, if you're going to say you're bowing your heart before God, okay, what's bowing? Have you ever bowed? Do you know what bowing is? But like in all of those things, it's hard to get away with saying, oh, well, that's just a symbol, and I do that symbolically.
Mhm.
Like, well, you don't know what the reference. you can't say you're doing it symbolically if you have no connection with the symbolic reference.
Yeah, well, it is a symbol and you're doing it symbolically, but a symbol is something that's participating in a heavenly reality.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
Yeah. Anyway.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I think we better take a break.
I think this has been our longest episode ever.
Oh yeah,
Maybe.
that's fine. We're chopping them short now. So
Lots of clips coming up, guys.
Yeah, there'll probably be 2 weeks ago for this one.
yeah.
Okay, well, anything else, John?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for being with us again today, and keep on participating in that conversation. We love your thoughts and your ideas and comments about our beards and things like that.
Yeah.
But no, thank you for being with us, and we wish you peace in Christ.